On guard. Prepare to have your fingers poked and prodded by the valiant, the humble, the tiny little sewing needle. My name's Christine and you're watching Home Economics. Today we're going to be learning how to hand sew. Sewing is a useful skill because there's a lot of things around the house that you can fix if you know how to sew, like curtains, pants or shirts that have rips or tears in them. If a button pops off, you can fix that. There's also a lot of crafty projects you can make for kids that involve sewing as well. And if you have the free time, sewing is a great hobby to take up. You can make some really cool clothes with it. So if you want to learn how to sew, there's only a few things you'll need. Obviously, you will need sewing needles. These come in packs of a bunch of different sizes. Just pick out which one feels the most comfortable in your hand. Some of them will have an eye that is a little bit bigger than others. Most of the time, they're going to be pretty small, and they'll only fit a few pieces of thread through at a time. That's because you don't want this to be too big. If it is, it will make large holes in your fabric where you're sewing through. You want to get a needle with as small of an eye as you are comfortable threading. Most of the time you're going to want a very sharp tip on your needle. That way you can poke through the fabric. The only instances where you wouldn't is if you're using a stretch fabric, like stretchy cotton, like a t-shirt. Another big thing, you're gonna need some thread. Thread comes in a bunch of different colors. It doesn't really matter what color you start with if you're just learning how to sew. It is generally recommended that you use a color of thread that matches your project. So if I have a purple piece of fabric, it's generally recommended to use a purple thread. If you're using a patterned fabric, it's recommended that you use a color of thread that will most match the largest color on your fabric. So if it's like a purple fabric with green polka dots, you'll want to use a purple thread for that as well. Pins are another big important accessory for sewing. They come in a bunch of different sizes and colors. They're going to have points on the top of them. That's the part you stick into the fabric, and they are sharp. And then on the other side, you're gonna have little balls. That way you can grab these comfortably with your hands and not poke yourself when you're sticking them through your fabric. These are used to pin pieces of fabric together while you're sewing. You don't wanna leave these in your finished pieces, and you're gonna take them out as you're sewing your seams. I also recommend buying a flexible tape measure when you are sewing. It's not as important when you're first starting out. If you're like making pillows and stuff, you can use a straight ruler for that. But you do want to use a flexible tape measure if you're ever taking your own measurements. So like if you're taking your neck measurement or your bust measurement or your arm measurement, it's nice to have a flexible tape measure for those measurements because you're not going to get an accurate measurement of yourself with a straight edge ruler. Of course, you're going to need some sort of scissors as well so you can clip your thread. Using your teeth to bite the thread is not a good idea. It's bad for your teeth and it's bad for your thread. It can pull too much on your fabric and make your stitches uneven as well. So I really do not recommend using your teeth to bite your thread. Go get a pair of scissors. So today I'm going to show you how to sew with this piece of fabric here. It doesn't matter what shape or size your fabric is, you just want to make sure you have one straight edge to sew along. You want to make sure you have a corner to go around here as well as a curved seam as well. There's a couple different ways to sew each type of stitch, and I want to make sure you know how to do that. You just want to make sure you have a cotton cloth that doesn't stretch when you pull it. It is best to start with a plain color fabric with no pattern on it, and then also use a thread that is contrasting so it shows up really well. That way you can look at your stitches and see how you're doing. So if you have everything ready, let's begin. So take about an arm's length of thread. I usually double mine up, so I'm going to take two arm's lengths of thread and cut it in half. If you wet the end of your thread a little bit, the pieces will stick together a little bit more and they'll be easier to thread through the eye of your needle. When you thread a needle, you're going to take the eye, which is the little hole on one end, and you're going to take your thread in the other hand and you're just going to slip the thread through the eye of that needle, like so, and pull it through. On the other end, we're going to tie a knot. So just very simply wrap it around 2 fingers and slip your end through the loop. Pull it tight, and you should have a knot in your thread here. Snip off any excess that you have over the end of your knot. Make sure your edges are lined up when you sew. You don't want to have them overlapping like this. What you are working on will not turn out well. If you're making some sort of clothing, it will not fit properly, and it also will make your seam a little bit bulky. So you want to make sure that you line your edges up properly when you're sewing like this. Pins are used to hold fabric together while you're sewing. You're going to insert the pin into the top of your fabric through both pieces, and then you're going to bring it out on the underside. This will hold your 2 pieces of fabric together, but you do generally want to use more than 1 pin while you're sewing. So it's best to go about, 3 inches apart, 2 inches apart, depending on the weight of your fabric. This will hold your fabric together while you're sewing. You just have to make sure that you don't get your thread caught on the pins, because then your stitches won't be even. So make sure you have enough pins in your fabric to hold it together so that it doesn't slip while you're sewing it. Oftentimes in movies and TV, you'll see people just take a needle and thread and loop it over the edge a few times like this. This is a very bad stitch. This makes a very unsightly seam. It's not very strong, and you can see on both sides, you will see the edge of your fabric. The goal in sewing is to have a very flush seam where you do not see either edge of your fabric on the opposite side. So do not ever do this seam. So probably the easiest stitch to use for a beginner is going to be the running stitch. So a running stitch, you're going to start at one side of the fabric and you're going to weave it in and out through both layers of fabric to the other side. When you get to the edge of your seam, you're going to want to tie another knot. This one you want to make sure you tie it closely to that edge of your fabric here. Snip off any excess here. You should be able to see here, this is a much stronger seam than just looping over the edge. When you open your seam, this is the inside of your fabric, you will see both edges of your fabric here. When you flip it over to the outside, you'll see your seam is much stronger. It's not going to pull apart and you don't see your thread coming through here. When you are sewing, you want to make your stitches as tight and uniform as possible, like this side over here. If your stitches are wider, it's not going to hold your fabric together as well. It'll be a lot looser. Your seam might pull open. It'll be easier to snap. So when you are hand sewing, you want to make sure you make your stitches nice and tightly together. They usually recommend about 7 to 14 stitches per inch while you are hand sewing. So the next stitch we're going to make across this side here is a back stitch. When you are hand sewing and you're trying to make a seam, that will be the go-to stitch for you. So instead of just weaving through the fabric, you're going to bring your stitch up from where you started. Bring your needle up just a little, pull it all the way through your fabric. And then we're going to go just underneath and pull it through the other side. And this is called a back stitch because you're going to bring it back up. So on the back side, again, we're going to bring it below. We're going to go down. And from the top side, you're going to bring it back up. And again, from the back side, you're going to go down. And you will bring it back up again. So this one will look a little bit different. You're going to have on this side here, it's very close together, so it's just, there's not a lot of gapping here. On this side there is a little bit more gapping because they made the stitch a little bit less tight together. This one on the left here is going to be stronger than the stitch over here. So if you want to make a nice tight seam, a very sturdy seam, you're going to want to make your stitches much closer together here. From the back side, these are going to look about the same. Like I said, it's a back stitch, so you're going to have this side overlapping backwards no matter how tightly or loosely you make your stitches. When you open your seam, you want it to be nice and sturdy. You can see here that since these stitches are not very tight, like I didn't pull really hard on the thread, you're going to see a little bit of your stitch come through. That's why you want to make your stitches smaller. Do like, you know, the 7 to 14 stitches per inch. The tighter you pull your thread when you're making your stitches, the less likely you will be to have this thread come through. You also don't want to tighten it too tight because then your fabric will pucker a little bit. This back stitch here is the most common stitch I use when I hand sew, when I'm trying to stitch seams together, or even when I'm sewing on a trim. I usually do a back stitch as well, just so that it's a little bit sturdier. So the last stitch we're going to go over is the quilting stitch. I've also heard it called the cable stitch, the blanket stitch. There's a few different names for it. But the quilting stitch is going to go on the very edge of the fabric. This stitch is not a sturdy stitch to sew two pieces of fabric together. You're either going to use it in conjunction with a straight stitch on the edge to finish that edge so it won't fray, or you're going to use it like on the edge of a cuff for decorative purposes, with like a thicker thread or an embroidery thread. So start this stitch right where your seam stitch is, your back stitch is here. This time we are going to loop over the edge of our fabric here. You're going to start with a loop through over the edge of your fabric, and then you're going to pull your needle through that loop. Make sure it's not too tight. You're going to sew along that back stitch here. Take your thread and you're going to loop it around that needle so that when you pull it tight, you have a little chain at the top. So when you are done with your quilting stitch, you will have what looks kind of a little bit jagged here with just a loop on the end. It's gonna look the same from both sides. This, like I said, this will finish your seam off so it won't fray over the edge of that quilting stitch, or you can use it decoratively on the edge of fabric that is already finished. So the next thing we're gonna cover is how to sew around a corner. So when you sew around a corner like this, you don't wanna sew straight, make a hard right angle, and then sew down. If you do that, your corner's gonna pucker a little bit. It's not gonna open flatly. So what we're gonna do is we're going to sew, you're gonna make your straight stitch here. You're gonna cut the corner about 2 to 3 stitches, and then you're gonna sew down. So in order to prevent that bunching up, you're going to make little incisions on the seam allowance. You don't want to cut through your thread. You don't want to cut through your seam, but you want to get as close to that seam as possible without allowing it to rip. You're just going to make a little incision right at the corner. When you iron that, it'll iron nice and flat. So whether you're making a curve or you're making a corner, you want to make sure you make little incisions in that seam allowance so that when it opens up, it's going to lay flat. So there's one more stitch that you're going to use, and that's going to be a blind hem stitch. When you make a hem, like on a pair of pants or a dress, you're going to fold your fabric twice and you're going to pin it. You want to make sure that the entire width, so the entire pant leg or the entire hem of the skirt, is folded in this manner and that it will lay flat. And you'll want to make sure that if it doesn't, you want to repin it along the edge as well. So some people like to make a nice thin hem, some people like to make it an inch thick. I'd say I usually do either a 1/4 inch hem or a 1/2 inch hem. I don't like to make them super wide. If you have, like, say a corner that you want to hem, you first want to fold the tip down and then bring the hem around it. So your point might look something like this. Really just depends on how much of a point you want and also how sturdy you want that to be. And when you're hemming and you get to a concave point, usually what you'll do is have just the very tip of it not be folded under, and you may have to do a little bit of a quilting stitch on the edge of that fabric to keep it from fraying, or use a little bit of fray check on there to strengthen it. Let's sew one side with a blind hem stitch and one with just a regular hem stitch that I would use, just so you can see the difference. We'll start with the blind hem stitch here. So when you sew a blind hem stitch, it's called blind because you won't see it from the front. We don't want to make a big dip into the fabric. We're going to catch just a few threads here. And of course you want to use the proper color for the fabric. This will be a little bit more visible because I'm using black on a purple. And again, catch just a hair, a little bit of that hem. A few threads here. And to catch the edge of that hem. So you're not going to see a large portion of fabric that this needle's going through. It's just a few threads here. It doesn't have to be a lot. Just pick a few threads. Feel free to move your pins around while you're sewing. They will get in the way. Your thread's going to get caught a lot. So move the pins around while you're sewing to avoid getting your thread caught on them. You can also do a sort of a back stitch. So you go back here, go up, and then angle backwards on your lower stitch as well. That'll give it a little bit more strength, but it can also pull the threads more. If your stitches are really tight, it may not look as nice. So we'll do it the same way as before. Bring just a little bit of your hem. And then instead of going with the fabric, you're gonna back stitch against it. Problem with this method is if you have too much tension, you can either warp your fabric by pulling it too tight, or you can warp the hem with it, or it'll just cause extra gaping holes in there that aren't necessarily wanted as well. So be careful if you're gonna back stitch with a blind hem stitch like this. So on this bottom edge here is where I did the blind hem stitch. You will see very little of that thread poking through on the front side. It's gonna look a lot nicer in a finished product. If on the top here, you'll see it's the same type of stitch, a blind hem stitch or crisscross here with the back stitch. But you'll see a little bit more popping through. This is a little bit of a stronger stitch, so be mindful of what type of project you're making. Sometimes this is a much stronger, better stitch for you to use than a complete blind hem stitch. Either one is not going to show a whole lot. But another type of stitch I like to use on a hem, it's going to be that stitch at the beginning that I said never try and sew two pieces of fabric together with. That actually works okay if you're just sewing a hem together. It's not very strong. It's very quick. I think this is technically called a whip stitch. So this whip stitch here, it works pretty well to finish a hem if you don't really care what it looks like too much and you don't need a really sturdy one. This is the inside of it. The part that would show, as you can see, there's a little bit more of it that's visible from the outside as compared to a blind hem stitch. But it's still not a whole lot that's visible. If you're working with like a black pair of pants and you're using a black thread on it, it's not going to be very visible. And this is a pretty easy stitch to use. Sometimes I also do running stitches on this, so I'll show you what a running stitch looks like as well. On the front side of your fabric, this is going to be a lot more visible. But like I said, if you are just trying to hem up a pair of jeans and you don't really care what it looks like, this is a viable stitch for that as well. When you start sewing, you're going to get a feel for which types of stitches you like better. There's a lot of different types of stitches to work with. There's a lot of different fabrics as well. But for this last part of our hem here, I actually have a little bit of trim to show you how to sew some trim onto a hem. If you want to sew your hem first here, and then sew your trim on the edge decoratively, you're welcome to do that. You can also sew your trim on while you're sewing your hem together. We're gonna take our trim and we're gonna fold the edge of it down just a little bit to keep it from unraveling. If you want, you can have an edge of the trim hanging up off, depending on the size of your trim. This one here is about the thickness of our hem, so we're just gonna line it up. We're going to put the lace or the trim on the outside, the part that would be visible. So we're going to start with a few stitches here. So it doesn't matter a whole lot what stitch you make when you are sewing lace on, especially if you're sewing it on with your hem. You want to make sure that your stitches are nice and straight. So I usually find a piece on the pattern to follow. So I'm going to follow a straight stitch along this bottom portion of the lace here. That'll coincide with where my hem is on the back side. I'm going to do a simple running stitch here. So there you'll have on the front side, that'll be visible. You'll have just a nice little piece of trim on the end. If you're new to sewing and you don't have very nice stitching, this is actually a really good way to finish an edge for you because it'll hide some of your stitching. And then like on the inside, it's just a regular running stitch like we did back here. When you use lace to finish an edge and you're going around a corner, it can be a little bit difficult. You can either cut the lace in different portions and fold it over that way. I usually like to take it and make a few folds. If you're using a lace to finish a hem, it will look something like this on the front side. That would be the visible side. And then on the back side, like I said, it's just going to look very similar to a regular running stitch on the back side. Be very patient with yourself when you're sewing because you will get knots. If you want to reduce the number of knots you get while you're hand sewing, use a shorter length of thread. You're more likely to get knots if you have a longer length of thread because it'll twist and your tail will get caught more easily. So that's basically the gist of it. You're going to use your running stitch, your back stitch, and your quilting stitch most of the time. Sometimes you will also want to use a blind hem stitch. That about sums up your sewing basics here. Ironing is another important part of sewing, and so are measurements. They're also very important, but I'm going to make another video on ironing and measuring. I will make sure to make a point of in every project I show you, so I'm not going to go too much into detail of that right now. As I said before, sewing is a really useful skill to have around the house, and it can also be a really fun hobby. If you want to start sewing, always start with hand sewing first. I started hand sewing making doll clothes when I was about 4 years old, and I didn't touch a sewing machine until I was in like elementary school. So give yourself some time to learn how to hand sew first. If you do want to learn how to sew, make sure that your stitches look nice and even. Make sure that your tension is really nice and tight and that the seams you're making are going to be able to hold up to being worn like in an actual pair of clothing, and that they'll look nice. So if you want to make decorative items, feel free to get fun with some lace and some trim and learn all the fun things that you can do with sewing as well. I have many more videos to come in sewing and crafting and also other home economics videos. So if you want to see more, hit that subscribe button and you'll get a notification every time I post one. Do hit that like button as well. Leave a comment if you have any questions or if you want to start sewing. If you have any projects that you want me to make, also let me know in the comments what you want me to make. Thank you for watching my video, everybody. I hope I will see you again soon. Bye!